On the far side of Shoal Creek stands a tree, gray and weathered. And at the right time of day, at the right time of year, should you happen to pause and listen very closely, you might hear the sound of a lonesome woman singing. Yellow poppies for my baby, blood and tears have bound me here. Heartless soul, go ever missing, blackened shadows drawing near. And should you happen to stay through that haunting melody, you might look up to see within the branches of the trees intertwined black and gray shadows dancing and weaving. A reminder to us all that the land never forgets. In 1852, Helen Livingston inherited a large sum of money from her late husband through the oil industry. Young, beautiful, and childless, she was eager to start a new life. And despite the warning of all the locals because of the recent Indian massacre, she decided that she was going to build her estate right upon Shoal Creek. The natives warned her that should she do that, she should anger the spirits, but she did not care and did not believe in such things. And so she went to work right away and hired Comanche workers as well as slaves. One day, as she was looking out upon her property, she called upon her gardener. As he came over to her, she said to him, "Look at all of this. Do you see it?" "Yes, ma'am, I do," he said. "This is all mine. Isn't it beautiful?" "Yes, ma'am, it is." "You're right. Except it's not. All of these trees are in the way of my sunset. Please remove all of these trees and do so by sunset. I should like to enjoy the sun. And all of these blackbirds that roost in the trees make the horrendous sound, and I cannot stand it. Remove it by twilight. Start right now," she said. But the gardener was a Comanche tribesman, and he paused for a moment, for he knew the dangers of such a request. And he said to her, "But ma'am, you do realize all of the trauma that has been inflicted upon this land. The spirits of the land are angry, and the ancestors will retaliate should you cause further harm. I cannot grant your request." She looked at him. Anger flashed across her face as she said, "Do it, and do so now. Otherwise pay the consequences." And he looked at her, and although he feared her, he feared the ancestors and the spirit of the land much worse, and he denied her request. And so that evening at sunset, as she looked across the land and saw all of the trees, there was one tree that she smiled upon. One tree, tall, gray, and weathered, where swinging from its branches was the lifeless body of the gardener who denied her request. That body served as a warning to all of the servants on her property that should they defy her, they would suffer the same fate. And so the next morning, when she called upon a young slave boy to do her bidding, he eagerly granted her request. And he set to work early in the morning, knowing that he had till twilight to finish his work. And so he toiled in the Texan sun. And as he did so, in the distance, a field girl walked forward, carrying a bouquet of poppies. It was his lover, and she came to him, giving him the poppies as a gift, wiping the sweat from his brow, kissing his cheeks, and singing him songs. And as she did this, he smiled and beamed, and his work seemed as if it was not so difficult after all, for here was his lover to help him through it. But little did he know, Helen Livingston sat and watched from her window. And as she sat and watched, she knitted. And as she knitted, she grew angrier and angrier. "Abigail!" she called. "Come here!" Abigail quickly came, and the housekeeper said, "Yes, ma'am." "Abigail, look out there and tell me what you see." Abigail looked out the window. Workers, ma'am." "That's right. But the boy and the girl, what do you see happening there?" I don't know, ma'am." "Abigail, tell me, are they in love?" No, ma'am, really, rightly, I don't know." "Abigail, give me your hand." And as she said this, Abigail extended her trembling hand. Helen took it and clenched it harder and harder within her grip as she took her sewing needle and pushed it into the tendons between the finger. And as she dug it within the skin, Abigail flinched with pain, and the more and more she flinched, the more pleasure Helen seemed to gain from it. "Tell me the truth, Abigail," she said. Abigail, not able to take the pain any longer, said, "Yes, yes. I'm sorry I didn't tell you earlier. Yes, he's been courting her all summer. I didn't tell you because, I'm sorry, ma'am. But yes, they are in love." "Thank you, Abigail. That's all I needed," Helen said. And as she dismissed the housekeeper, she sat there staring out the window. And that evening, at twilight, as she gazed across the land, she smiled, because there was a land barren of trees, save one, the hanging tree. Only this time, the hanging tree bore the lifeless body of not the Comanche gardener, but the young slave boy, who had fallen in love with another worker under her eye. And as his body swung in the trees, an evil smirk spread across her face at her victory. "That will show them," she said. And that night, as she went to bed, the young slave girl went out. And when she saw her lover's body hanging from the tree, her heart broke into 1,000,000 pieces, and she fell at the tree weeping and crying, saying, "How could this happen?" And in that moment, she went all the way back to her voodoo roots and knew what she must do. For this young girl was not just any slave girl. She came from a long lineage of witchcraft. And so she went back to her humble abode, gathered her things, and came back at midnight and stood at the foot of the tree. And as she stood at the foot of the tree, she whispered prayers and curses as she gathered poppies and spread them out in formations beneath the tree. And then climbing up the tree, she took her knife and she cut the rope, and her lover's body fell to the floor upon the poppies. And she looked at her lover's face, and she fell to him, kissing him, holding his lifeless body in her arms. And as she held him, she sang, "Yellow poppies for my baby, blood and tears have bound me here, heartless soul go ever missing, blackened shadows drawing near." And in that moment she took her knife and she slid it across her wrists. And as she did, the blood dripped upon the lips of her lover, and she fell and collapsed upon his arms and held him, two lovers entwined in blood and tears. The next morning, all of the workers were horrified to see what happened. and Helen Livingston ordered them to be immediately hauled away and dumped into the creek. And as their bodies were hauled away, there was something upon the root of the tree that caught the servant's eye. Roots that seemed to be unearthing and reaching and grasping, and the sound of whispering wishes. The servants retreated. They knew this magic. And for the days to follow, Helen Livingston continued to be as cruel as ever, hanging body after body of anyone who defied her. But something peculiar happened, and that peculiar thing was that with each body that hung from the tree, a swarm of blackbirds would gather around it, and with each body that was lost, a blackbird was gained, until the swarm grew so big that the murder of birds weighed the branches of the trees down. And the locals said that with every soul lost, they became a bird to haunt that tree. But remember, the land never forgets, and the tree stored within its roots the misery of the suffering that Helen Livingston had created. Nobody actually knows what happened to Helen Livingston. Our records indicate that she went missing. However, locals have another story. One evening, as Helen was walking along admiring her barren landscape at twilight, she came upon the hanging tree. And as she walked by, she heard the sound of a swish, swish. She paused. That's just the wind, she thought. And as she continued to walk, she paused again, because the swishing grew and grew in sound, until all of a sudden she heard the utterance of these words: I will not let you win. And in that moment, Helen fell to the floor, and as she fell to the floor, a swarm of blackbirds came and covered her, plucking at her limbs, plucking at her eyes, and blood gushed forth. And as it gushed forth and blinded her, she screamed in horror and pain. And as she screamed in horror and pain, the servants could hear her in the distance, but they did not intervene, for they knew the vengeance of the land was taking hold. And as she screamed in horror and pain, lying and writhing upon the floor, she felt the coiling around her limbs of the roots of the trees who had suddenly unearthed themselves, and like long, swarmy fingers, they grabbed her body and clenched her and pulled her down, down, down into the earth, beneath the soil, into the roots, until she was gone. And there was no trace of Helen Livingston. It is said that her body continues to writhe and scream in torture beneath the soil of the hanging tree. It is said that at the right time of day, at the right time of year, if you are still and silent, you can hear the screaming of Helen. It is also said that at the right time of day, at the right time of year, beneath the tall, gray, and weathered tree, should you pause for a moment, you might hear the sound of a lonesome woman singing. Yellow poppies for my baby, blood and tears have bound me here. Heartless soul, go ever missing, blackened shadows drawing near.